The canopy shook like a hand in a storm. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Robert Hayes saw the needle climb past the number he had been chasing, 7,800 meters on the altimeter. The little glass dome of the manifold pressure gauge sitting higher than he had ever dared hold, and the air filling the cabin with the dry, chemical smell of hot fuel and ozone. The radial engines behind him were not merely loud, they sang in a way that made his teeth ache, a metallic alto that promised both speed and strain. On his headset, static braided with the clipped voice of Captain Samuel Ortega. "Hold it, Hayes, hold it steady, record everything." If you want the full account of how a change in the chemistry of aviation fuel reshaped tactics on the front, stay with this story to the end. And if detailed histories like this matter to you, subscribe and leave a like. They called it, at first in lab notebooks and then in refinery ledgers, the 150 grade program. A concentrated push to raise knock resistance and deliver a fuel that would let fighters run higher manifold pressures without the detonation that had capped their power plants for years. The names attached to the work read like a chain from bench to runway. Edward Langley, the chemist with oil under his nails and a habit of sketching pressure curves in the margins of letters, kept the notebooks. Margaret Cole, the refinery manager with a ledger-like mind, moved the pilot's requests into pilot runs on the floor. Walter Grimes and Dr. Helen Park tended catalysts and temperaments. Anna Morales read the rail manifests and rerouted tankers at night. Pilots Hayes, Ortega, Elena Ruiz flew the experiments into airspace that, until then, had been governed more by caution than by performance. The genesis was tactile. Langley's early pages recorded tests on small reformer charges. The catalyst beds warmed and readjusted, data points arranged like a refrain, aromatic content up, paraffinic fraction down, measured motor octane number rising by incremental tenths. For readers unfamiliar with the term, octane rating is a shorthand for a fuel's resistance to knock, premature detonation under compression. In an aircraft engine, higher octane meant the throttle could be opened further, higher manifold pressure, without the violent pressure spikes that shred pistons. Simple on paper, octane, knock resistance, allowed boost, horsepower, climb, and speed. The devil, however, was in the details. Langley's laboratory smelled of solvent and heated oil. He moved through the place as if through a map. The gas chromatography, its quiet ticking. The dynamometer, where test engines coughed and coughed into measured torque. Rows of amber vials labeled with dates and temperatures. He was methodical to the point of ritual. In one journal entry, dramatized later from his ledger, he wrote, "Increased reformer severity by 12%. Aromatic fraction rose. TEL dosing unchanged. Repeat at lower space velocity." It was the sort of terse prose that only made sense when someone could stand at the bench and read the gauges alongside him. Catalytic reforming formed the chemical backbone of the change. Where conventional blending adjusted proportions, reforming altered the molecules themselves. Straight-chain paraffins cracked, cyclized, and reassembled into aromatics that burned with a different pressure profile. The refinery crews increased severity, higher temperatures, different feed conditions, and they swapped catalyst loadings to a slightly heavier platinum presence. Dr. Helen Park watched the catalyst bed temperatures creep upward on her tablet. The platinum loadings ticked on the chart. Walter Grimes stood on the reformer platform with a clipboard and a rigger's habit of listening to equipment the way others listen to music. Tetraethyl lead, TEL, remained a necessary adjunct. TEL dosing was not the headline, it was the safety margin. When Langley's formulation increased base knock resistance through aromatic enrichment, the TEL could be used at lower relative amounts, or, more usefully, timed to smooth transients during rapid power changes. The documents the narrative leaned on, bench logs and dosing charts, showed the threefold mechanism clearly. Catalytic reforming plus aromatic enrichment plus measured TEL dosing yielded an effective 150 grade responsiveness on engines that had previously pinged and protested at high boost. On the test bench a month after the first reformer trials, dynamometer logs recorded that an engine sustained indicated horsepower figures previously seen only in constrained bursts. Langley, having stood too long leaning over the bench, had oil smears on his cuff and a grin that was both professional and nervous. In the control room, Dr. Park read out cylinder pressure traces. "Look at the knock window," she said. 0.2 lower across the mid-range. The term knock window was shorthand for when and where the engine's combustion became violent. Lowering it was like tightening a leash around an uncooperative beast. Pilots were skeptical. That skepticism had a practical jawline. An engine that could run higher boost but then fail catastrophically in combat was worse than one that simply lacked speed. Maintenance crew members who fixed the aircraft worried about the unseen consequences: valve seats, valve recession, lead fouling in spark plugs if dosing wasn't precise. Early test flights tried to bridge that gap. Lieutenant Hayes's flight that reached the 7,800-meter ceiling that day was not just a stab at speed. It was a literal probe of the hypothesis that the fuel, when combined with adjusted timing and slightly richer mixture settings, would let aviators sustain higher manifold pressures for longer climbs. The in-flight log, reconstructed from radio transcripts and cockpit notes, was terse and mechanical. Boost plus 1.5, Hayes reported. RPM stable. Manifold holding. Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Hayes reported. RPM stable. Manifold holding. Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Inglês com subtítulos. A later engineer's annotation noted the exact boost relative to standard settings. That simple change in manifold pressure translated into indicated horsepower that the flight test engineers converted into speed gains. In controlled settings, the 150 grade runs produced top-end indicated speeds peaking at 490 miles per hour on one calibrated reading. Combat reports, less disciplined but more telling, would later suggest that pilots experienced gains in the field of between 30 and 50 miles per hour in specific engagement envelopes, enough to change intercept windows and chasing vectors. The throughput question followed inescapably. One engine test does not a campaign win make. The refinery had to scale from pilot runs of a few thousand gallons to supply lines that could fill fight operations at theater scale. Margaret Cole, who had earned a reputation for moving capital through stubborn systems, convened meetings under the hum of refinery night shifts. The pilot-run tanks had worked. The plant's ledgers showed that within roughly 3 months they had taken production from an initial 50,000 gallons to a sustained monthly throughput that approached 1.2 million gallons. The ledger lines, annotated with rail car numbers and tank farm addresses, were as much a portrait of industrial will as they were of chemistry. Scaling required concrete moves. The refinery raised the reformer severity and adjusted space velocities. They changed from a nominal 0.8 LHSV to slightly lower values to increase contact time on catalyst. Platinum loadings were marginally increased to offset coking tendency. Blending tanks were refitted with higher shear mixers to ensure aromatic fractions were homogeneous, and TEL dosing apparatus were fitted with redundancies. Night crews swapped out piping after heat stress inspections. Anna Morales rerouted shipments, pressing rail logistics officers into running extra wagons along lines previously reserved for petrol and munitions. It was a logistics ballet. Tank cars diverted, seals checked, Manila manifests stamped. The smell of diesel and hot rubber became as much a motif for the program as the smell of reformer overheads in the lab. But scaling revealed trade-offs. Maintenance shops cataloged parts more aggressively once the 150 program went operational. By the 6th week of broader field use, maintenance logs showed increased replacement rates for certain components, spark plugs, valve guides, and frequently the rear main seals of some engine batches, quantified as a rise in spare parts consumption roughly in the range of 20 to 30%. The cost was not merely fiscal. Crews working under blackout conditions had to pull more engines from wings, strip heads on muddy fields, and patch cowling with urgency that officers muttered about supply chain fragility. Tension thickened between those who wanted the performance at all costs and those who saw the industrial toll. Margaret Cole negotiated in the vocabulary of contracts and manifests.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "and in the vocabulary of contracts and manifests". Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Langley argued in the parlance of experiments and tolerance bands. We can reduce TEL transient spikes if we adjust timing across the map, he told the maintenance officers in a briefing whose minutes were later summarized in an operations note. But we cannot remove the mechanical stress increases entirely. This is a trade-off. The way he said it, practical, without theatrical resignation, made clear that he viewed the problem as solvable at the margin, not as a moral calculus. Field commanders reacted to the new envelopes of performance like sailors discovering a current they could ride. Commander Edward Price re-evaluated interception doctrine in light of recorded speed readings. Marco Silva, working in the Theater Intelligence Office, annotated captured enemy communiques to note that adversary pilots had started to report unexpected closure rates and sudden acceleration on throttle in their post-engagement write-ups. Intelligence assessments pieced together from decoded signals, pilot interrogations, and local airfield observations suggested that the fuel's performance had tactical implications. Faster climbs shortened engagements where altitude exchange favored one side, and the ability to hold higher boost in a dive or sprint altered who could disengage versus who could close. The moment of demonstration, public, not politically so, but operational, came on a damp morning at the airfield when phenomena and practice converged. Elena Ruiz taxied in after a maintenance crew had changed a suspect spark plug and adjusted the magneto timing to account for the higher aromatic blend. Her voice over the net was calm. "Vector clear, climb at max continuous, watching for knock." The ears on the ground listened as if expecting a note. The P-51 left the runway like a door opening. The first several seconds were a test of nerve. Later, instrumented telemetry from the flight showed a controlled climb rate that, when fed into predicated drag curves, suggested intercepts that would have, under previous fuel constraints, been impossible in that window. But the arc of innovation rarely ends in tidy victory. 3 months into wider deployment, a maintenance diary entry recorded a catastrophic engine failure in a squadron that had been pushing manifold pressures in prolonged combat sorties. The description in the investigative report avoided the gruesome. It did not need detail to make the human cost legible. The sound reported by the pilot was a metallic scream, then silence. Ground crew accounts emphasized smell, hot oil, burnt metal, and procedural collapse. A hurried attempt at an emergency landing, a fuel sample taken to the lab and later found to be contaminated with particulate introduced during a field blending procedure.
The report's conclusion was procedural and systemic. A convergence of rushed field blending, an overlooked seal in a transfer line, and an over-enthusiastic adoption of high boost settings that exceeded a particular engine batch's tolerance led to failure. Investigators leaned on method more than metaphor. They reconstructed hours from service logs and sampling reports. They traced the contamination to a makeshift pump that had been substituted in a forward depot when a scheduled maintenance had been delayed by rail congestion. It was a lesson in fragility. The chemistry might be right, the refinery might produce millions of gallons, but the integrity of supply chains, seals, filters, field blending protocols mattered as much as octane numbers. Langley, sitting across from maintenance officers, read the summary with a face that showed professional contrition. "We underestimated the system," he said. "We must make the dosing and blending foolproof at every link." The corrective measures were precise and bureaucratic. Blending procedures in forward depots were standardized with checklists and tamper-proof seals. Field pumps were replaced with units that had redundant filters and verifiable flow meters. TEL dosing units were fitted with lockouts that disabled dosing if flow rates were abnormal. The refinery instituted a monitoring regime that sampled train shipments at both origin and theater intake points. Anna Morales oversaw manifests that now included chemical signatures and chain of custody stamps. The numbers in the refinery ledger adjusted not just for throughput, but for quality assurance. Percentage of batches tested, reject rates, and compliance incidents. These were not romantic changes, they were administrative armor against cascade failure. Strategically, the advantage persisted because of adaptation across multiple levels. Pilots learned to modulate boost according to engine batch tolerances and to listen for the subtle acoustic cues of imminent knock. Maintenance crews improved torque sequences and head bolt patterns, reducing microfractures over repeated high boost cycles. Commanders rewrote sortie profiles to leverage the speed edge in specific windows, short sprints, and controlled climbs, rather than treating the extra horsepower as a universal upgrade. Intelligence officers modeled intercept possibilities with updated drag and performance tables, and then fed those models into tactical briefs that trained units used to rehearse engagement geometry. Across the months from the first reformer trial to theater saturation, the numbers told a mixed story. Production scaled from 50,000 to roughly 1.2 million gallons per month within about 3 months of committed plant changes and logistics prioritization. Pilots reported speed gains of 30 to 50 miles per hour in certain regimes. Maintenance shops logged a 20 to 30% increase in parts consumption for the components most stressed by higher boost.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: I did who could fly when. The airfield where L.T. Hayes had pushed the needle to 7,800 meters remained an emblem. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. The technical chain, catalytic reforming, aromatic enrichment, tel dosing had, in the end, shown how laboratory adjustments could ripple through metal and map alike. It had shown, too, that gains were contingent. They demanded oversight, redundancy, and a humility about every link in the chain. We will return to the catastrophic failure that forced the most consequential policy change and to the quiet reforms that turned a near disaster into a more resilient program. But first, the ledger must be read and the people remembered for the way they kept their places in the chain. The catastrophe began, as most disasters do, where attention thinned and assumptions thickened. At a forward depot on a rain-dark night, where schedules were late and men were tired. A convoy had arrived with drums and tanker compartments bearing hastily scribbled manifests. The blending order for that shift had been changed twice, by radio and by hand. And the night operator who signed the last sheet did so with the same glove he had used to patch a pump seal an hour earlier. Somewhere in that chain, a valve was left partially open, a sump was not drained, a sample bottle was not replaced. The fuel that finally left the depot and climbed into service carried with it a composition that no chemist had meant to authorize. A streak of contaminant, a mismatch of aromatic load and lead dosing. It revealed itself first in the smallest of places. On the second sortie of a dawn patrol, an engine stumbled. No bang, no flame, only the shudder that sits between sound and silence. The pilot kept formation. He feathered power, then shoved it again. Instruments showed no clear fault. A second aircraft reported the same hesitation. By the third minute, 3 men were radioing stalled accelerations and surging compressors. By the 5th minute, 1 was gone from the sky. The board that convened afterward found a cluster of failures rather than a single cause. The sample logs had 2 stamps, but only 1 was legible. A pump seal replacement that should have forced a line purge had been signed without the purge performed. The lead dosing guns had not been calibrated to the new aromatic proportion. And, crucially, a shortened manifest trail meant neither the forward commander nor the fuel chemist had seen the final composition before it reached flight lines. The language of the inquiry was clinical, its conclusions were not.
For the men who had been on the night shift, the hearing was a crucible. The operator who had changed the seal testified with hands that would not stop recalling the heat of the reformer core. He swore he had followed the checklist, but could not say why the purge had been skipped. The logistics officer, who had rerouted the tanker at dusk, explained, with quiet anger, that the theater's tempo had left no room for ideal sequencing. Pilots who survived spoke of a sensation they compared to the loss of traction on ice, the sudden, treacherous denial of confidence. Langley, summoned as an expert witness, wrote in his notes that the material failure was a thing of beads and pumps and seals, but its root was the cultural permission to improvise under fatigue. The policy response that followed was neither theatrical nor instantaneous. There were reprimands, some public, some filed away, and there were, more importantly, concrete changes that reshaped the program's habit. The most immediate edict limited the use of the experimental blends to squadrons with on-site sampling benches and certified chemists. No fuel would be issued forward without a signed blending certificate and a certificate of analysis. Blending itself was consolidated into fewer, better supervised facilities. Field blending, once praised for its speed, was now allowed only under written, overseen authority. Logistics learned the language of seals. Every drum and compartment received a tamper tag and a manifest that followed it until a chemist opened the nozzle. Manifests were no longer scrawled, but printed and countersigned. Where once a single ledger might suffice, redundant records were kept in separate locations. Major changes to the processes were accompanied by new training programs. Technicians were not merely taught to replace parts, but to witness the purge of lines, to sample and to read chromatograms, to smell and note the slightest sweet or metallic hints that once had seemed anecdotal and were now codified into alarm thresholds. The aeromechanical community adjusted too. Pre-flight fuel sampling became as routine as control checks. Test benches at forward fields were fitted with cartridges that could detect misdosing and aromatic spikes within minutes. Flight orders began to include a line on certified grade and sample number. A pilot who launched without the line ticked could be grounded without question. Maintenance logs expanded to include not only part replacements, but the exact serial numbers of samples drawn and their microanalytical signatures. It was tedious work, but it turned accidents that once looked like bad fortune into preventable outcomes. Perhaps most significant was the cultural shift. Where improvisation had been a virtue, quick thinking on a wagon, a mechanic patching a seal with what was at hand, bureaucracy learned to value the slow check as a form of care. Langley articulated this in a memo that circulated the program. Innovation required rituals of containment. Speed without audit was a recipe for catastrophe. Cole annotated the ledgers with a new column for traceability, a quiet, financial-minded insistence that every extra minute spent checking was an investment against loss. The reforms did not erase the costs, nor did they flatten the human texture that had made the program what it was. Pilots still spoke, in bars and on flight lines, of the strange exhilaration of a full boost and of the fear that the exhilaration courted. Technicians kept, in private, small superstitions. An old torque wrench signed by a departed mentor, a coffee stain on a notebook that marked a fortunate inspection. The ledger entries grew longer and more meticulous. The poems of the air remained short and terse. When, months later, the same squadron that had lost men that dawn flew with the new safeguards in place, their sorties read differently in the logs. Speed figures were still recorded, still praised, but alongside them were lists of sample numbers, cross-check stamps, and the names of chemists who had held the blending certificate in their hands. The aircraft still rose and rushed the sky, and pilots still felt that metallic alto in their chests. Only now, that feeling was shared with a back end of signatures and seals that had to be respected. Historians who later cataloged the program's life cycle would point to that morning as pivot, not because the technology had failed, materials and formulas had given the promised edge, but because the human systems had not been ready to carry it. The failure underscored an enduring lesson. Gains that are sharp at the tactical edge require broad institutional scaffolding to be safe and sustainable. The policy changes that followed turned isolated competence into collective assurance. They redistributed responsibility across nodes that had previously been loose and informal. There was inevitably blame. Some officers lost command, some were reassigned. But among those who read the inquiry's pages, the dominant memory was of a network that had learned to carry weight anew. The reforms were not merely paperwork, but a reorientation toward sampling, toward redundancy, toward the slow, often invisible labor that makes a daring capability repeatable rather than perilous. Even as procedures hardened, the human stories persisted. The logistics officer who had rerouted the tanker at dusk took to watching manifests like a hawk. At night, he would sit with a thermos and a stack of certificates, tracing the ink as if it were a path to redemption. Langley, who had once romanticized the chemist's curve, now emphasized margins and protocols in his public lectures. His notebooks grew more bureaucratic and, some said, wiser. Cole's ledgers, once neat columns of cost and benefit, accumulated marginalia that read like counsel. When in doubt, sample twice.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. A frase anterior era Read like counsel. When in doubt, sample twice. Esta é a conclusão. Aumente a emoção para o nível máximo, mantendo a potência e termine com uma pausa solene e impactante. The program's second phase, characterized now by institutionalized quality assurance and disciplined logistics, began to show its own quieter rewards. Sorties that might once have been too risky were now routine because the back end ensured their safety. Pilots who had once felt a temporary liberation in speed began, in time, to value the steadiness of a persistently reliable thrust. The 490-mile bursts remained memorable, but they no longer carried with them the same dread. Yet the moral of that dawn remained double-edged. The added layers of process consumed time and manpower, and the logistical tail lengthened. Supply lines became heavier with paperwork and cautious steps. The tempo of operations sometimes slowed. Commanders learned that safety came at a cost in agility. The program settled into a new equilibrium, less flashy perhaps, but more survivable. And in the quiet rooms where men kept small records and signatures, the memory of those who had been lost kept a kind of moral pressure on everyday decisions. Checklists were signed not as rote ritual, but as a compact with those absent names. The night operator who had replaced a catalyst pellet and later testified at the inquiry returned to his bench and found, years later, a trainee whose hands trembled the way his once had. He taught the purge ritual slowly, as if handing down a small liturgy, making sure the trainee did not skip the step he himself had missed. So the ledger was read, and the people were remembered.
The program matured, not into an infallible machine, but into a system that could own its fragility and act on it. Small reforms, color-coded tags, duplicate manifests, mandated sampling became the scaffolding for the daring experiments to come. The near disaster remained an ache in the program's memory, a lesson written in names and signatures, and it shaped the silence between throttle and sky for years thereafter. There were, however, further reckonings still to come. Newer fuels that would test the revised processes, diplomatic frictions over supply sources, and the slow bureaucratic erosion that always threatens carefully built safeguards. But those were matters for another ledger. For now, the program stood transformed, sharper in technique, steadier in practice, haunted and guided by a morning when chance and haste had turned an advantage into loss. The work of keeping that transformation alive, as always, fell to the people who read the ledgers and held the seals, one careful hour at a time.